Lorenzo Herdero walked through the courthouse hallways with firm steps and an unwavering gaze. His presence commanded respect, and even the most experienced lawyers lowered their eyes when he passed by. Young and wealthy, his meteoric rise in the judiciary was a source of admiration and envy. None of his decisions had ever been successfully challenged. To many, Lorenzo was the very embodiment of cold, unyielding justice. In his personal life, however, the reality was quite different. Surrounded by luxury, mansions, and sports cars, he lived in a world of material excess. But behind the golden walls, there was loneliness. Friendships were rare and superficial, always based on self-interest. All that remained was the image he cultivated, flawless, impenetrable, unreachable. The press portrayed him as a prodigy. Headlines praised his intelligence, his strictness, and his promising youth. But between the lines there were veiled criticisms of his inhuman coldness. To society, Lorenzo was the judge who didn't flinch at tears or pleas. He was a man of steel, never allowing emotions to interfere with his rulings. The lawyers who faced him knew it well. There was no room for emotional appeals in his courtroom. His judgments were based on logic, concrete evidence, and literal interpretations of the law. If someone was looking for compassion, they wouldn't find it in his court. Lorenzo believed that pity weakened justice. At home, however, when he took off his robe, only silence remained. Luxury couldn't fill the emptiness consuming him. He avoided family photos, memories, and conversations about the past. Any mention of his deceased sister was immediately shut down. That subject was a ghost haunting his inner halls, one he never allowed to surface. His nights were marked by insomnia. Lorenzo would review case files endlessly, as if work alone could silence the echoes in his mind. Sleeping was dangerous because dreams insisted on bringing back images he had sworn to bury. So he preferred to stay awake, even if it meant solitude, rather than face those memories. Despite his apparent coldness, his body betrayed the weight he carried. Deep dark circles under his eyes, slightly trembling hands, and constant tension in his shoulders showed that even the hardest rock wears down over time. Yet he refused to admit weakness, not to himself, and especially not to others. His closest colleagues, though they admired him, saw him as an enigma. There was no room for casual conversations or personal confidences. Lorenzo had no confidants, only subordinates and rivals. To him, trust was a currency too rare to spend.
Deep down, Lorenzo believed that was precisely his role, to wear the mask of perfection without ever letting it slip. To him, showing humanity was showing vulnerability, and vulnerability, in the world he lived in, was synonymous with defeat. And so, Lorenzo went about his routine, convinced that nothing could shake the fortress he had built over the years. What he didn't know was that soon, his own past would return to tear down the empire of ice he had so carefully constructed. If you also believe that behind a cold exterior there can be hidden pain, subscribe to the channel now. This story will show you that masks don't always reveal the truth. The next morning, the courtroom was packed for a trial that had caught the media's attention. The defendant was a young woman in her early 20s named Isabella, a technology expert accused of hacking into the financial system and illegally moving millions. To many, it was a serious crime, worthy of severe punishment. Lorenzo entered the courtroom with his usual imposing presence. His black robe enhanced the aura of authority that surrounded him. The audience immediately fell silent, and camera flashes stopped as he took his seat. His gaze swept over the room like a blade, finally settling on the defendant. Isabella, despite the tension, held his gaze without looking away.
The prosecutors presented their case with confidence, describing every line of code they had traced and every transaction that was made. The case against her was solid, backed by technical evidence that would be hard to challenge. Many believed the young woman's fate was already sealed before the trial even began. On the other side, the defense waited for its turn. Isabella's lawyer, an experienced and persuasive man, seemed to have something held back for the right moment. His eyes showed confidence, as if he was about to play an unexpected card. As the minutes passed, Lorenzo remained impassive, taking cold, precise notes. To him, so far, it was just another case to be decided, a life he would judge with the same rigor as always. Nothing seemed capable of breaking his iron composure. Isabella, however, didn't seem to be just another defendant. Her demeanor suggested something different, not the arrogance of a criminal, but the dignity of someone who knew there was a greater cause behind her actions. Her breathing was steady, and her eyes showed both pain and determination. The atmosphere in the room grew heavier by the minute. The audience waited anxiously for the moment the defense would finally present its arguments. Something in the air said that this wouldn't be just another ordinary trial.
Unmoved by the expectations around him, Lorenzo remained convinced that the law should be applied without exceptions. But somewhere deep inside, a sense of unease began to stir. It wasn't rational. It was almost instinctive, as if something about that young woman had the power to pierce through his defenses. When the defense attorney finally stood up, the tension became almost palpable. He adjusted his glasses, took a deep breath, and announced that he would reveal the true motivation behind Isabella's actions. The courtroom fell silent, and all eyes, including Lorenzo's, fixed on him. What came next would be the first crack in the fortress of arrogance and certainty that Lorenzo had built. The case that had seemed straightforward was about to become a cruel mirror of his own past. Isabella's lawyer began speaking in a steady voice, emphasizing that his client's actions were not driven by greed or ambition. He asked everyone to listen not just with their ears, but with their hearts. Lorenzo raised an eyebrow, impatient and used to emotional appeals. Still, something in the lawyer's confident tone held his attention. The man then revealed the motivation behind the crime. Isabella had hacked the financial system to pay for her seriously ill sister's medical treatment. The revelation spread through the courtroom like lightning, sparking murmurs and stunned looks. Some frowned with compassion, while others pressed their lips in judgment. Isabella, who had been silent until then, let tears stream down her face. They weren't tears of regret, but of frustration and love. "I couldn't let her die," she said, her voice trembling. "If that makes me a criminal, then so be it." The silence that followed was absolute. Lorenzo kept his eyes fixed on her, but inside, something began to twist. Her story echoed painfully in his mind. He tried to push the thought away, repeating to himself that his duty was to judge by the law, not by emotion. But Isabella's words had already struck a chord too deep to ignore. The lawyer continued, presenting medical records and receipts that proved the defendant's sister was fighting a severe illness. The evidence was clear. Isabella wasn't seeking profit, she was seeking salvation. Her illegal act had been driven by desperation and unconditional love. In the audience, some spectators discreetly wiped away tears. Journalists exchanged glances, already envisioning headlines that went beyond a simple cybercrime story. This was a human story no one could ignore. Lorenzo, meanwhile, gripped his gavel tightly, as if it could contain the whirlwind growing in his chest. Memories began to force their way in against his will, bringing back a pain he had sworn he buried years ago. The young woman before him seemed, in some way, to carry the voice of another girl, a voice he had avoided hearing, but now returned with almost unbearable clarity. His heart raced, and his usual composure no longer seemed so unshaken.
The lawyer concluded his statement with a question that hung in the air. Can justice truly be just when it turns a blind eye to the love that drives our actions? Lorenzo swallowed hard, unable to give an immediate answer, feeling that the question wasn't just for the court, it was for him alone. As soon as the defense rested, Lorenzo leaned back slightly in his chair, trying to regain his composure. But when he closed his eyes for a moment, he was flooded with memories he had long avoided. He saw his sister's face, pale but smiling, asking for his help in her final days. Back then, Lorenzo had chosen to hide behind commitments and excuses, convinced that showing emotion would be a sign of weakness. His sister had begged for his support, but he had refused to listen. His pride had kept him from reaching out, and by the time he realized it, it was already too late. The images came back with brutal force. The hospital room, the steady beep of machines, the last look she gave him before closing her eyes forever. It was a memory he suppressed every day, but now it resurfaced with the same intensity as when it happened. He opened his eyes abruptly, staring at Isabella again. The similarity between their stories was unsettling. The young woman before him was fighting for her sister, something he had failed to do for his own. The contrast burned like hot iron in his chest. He tried to take a deep breath and mentally recite the principles of the law to steady himself. But the words, once solid, now sounded hollow. For the first time in years, Lorenzo questioned whether the justice he practiced was truly just or just a mask to hide his own cowardice. Outside the courtroom, the audience waited in silence, unaware of the internal battle raging within the judge. To everyone else, he still seemed like the same impenetrable man. Only he knew that his walls were about to crumble. As the hearing continued, Lorenzo took notes mechanically, not really processing anything. His mind was elsewhere, filled with ghosts. The courtroom had become a mirror, reflecting not just the defendant, but his own past. Isabella's gaze, steady and full of pain, seemed to pierce right through him. It was as if she were the voice of his sister, silently accusing him of neglect. The weight became unbearable, and he began to feel his rigid composure cracking. In that moment, Lorenzo understood that this trial wasn't just about Isabella. It was about him, too. And for the first time, he didn't know what sentence he could possibly deliver.
Lorenzo leaned over the case file in front of him, trying to mask his growing tension. But his hand trembled slightly as he held his pen, betraying the struggle within. The audience didn't notice, but those in the front row who were paying attention saw the difference. For the first time, the untouchable judge seemed human.
He took a deep breath, trying to regain control. But every word Isabella had spoken echoed in his mind like hammer blows. The silence of the courtroom, which had once made him feel powerful, now felt suffocating. It was as if every pair of eyes was focused not on the defendant, but on him. The prosecutor spoke again, reiterating the technical evidence and calling for a harsh conviction. His words were rational and severe, but Lorenzo could barely hear him. The speech sounded distant, muffled, as if it were coming from another room. His mind was in another time, in another room, facing another sister. Trying to pull himself together, he looked out at the audience. He saw a range of expressions, some silently pleading for mercy with their eyes, others demanding strict punishment. Every face seemed to reflect a different facet of the turmoil raging inside him. It was impossible to remain unaffected. Lorenzo adjusted himself in his chair, forcing himself to put back on his mask of severity. The gavel in his hand felt like it weighed a ton. He wanted to believe he was still in control, but the truth was becoming clear. His pride was unraveling, piece by piece. In a moment of weakness, he looked away from Isabella, as if avoiding a mirror. But his conscience pulled him back, forcing him to face her. There was no escaping it. There she was, a living representation of his own failure, of what he had denied for years. The audience watched, intrigued by the unusual amount of time Lorenzo was taking to speak. Journalists scribbled quick notes, sensing the growing tension. The judge, who never hesitated, now seemed trapped in a maze of emotions. He subtly passed a hand over his face as if trying to wipe away invisible marks. The gesture, though simple, was rare for him, and it caught everyone's attention. His armor was beginning to show cracks, and the collective curiosity grew with each passing second. Inside, Lorenzo felt his fortress crumbling. The pride that had sustained him for years no longer felt like enough. An old pain consumed him, and he knew he was at a crossroads, one that would define not only Isabella's fate, but his own. And so, in the heart of the court, Lorenzo realized he could no longer hide. The collapse wasn't just inevitable, it had already begun. The silence in the courtroom seemed to scream. Lorenzo felt watched from all sides, but the real enemy wasn't in front of him. It was within. His pride pulled him toward delivering a harsh sentence, but compassion pushed him toward a new and unfamiliar path. He remembered his sister, fragile and hopeful, and how he had ignored her pleas for help. Isabella's words echoed cruelly in his mind. I couldn't let her die. The judge felt crushed between the memory that haunted him and the young woman now begging for justice.
In that moment, Lorenzo realized it wasn't just Isabella on trial. It was him. The robe he wore was no longer a symbol of authority, but a burden carrying his guilt. Every heartbeat seemed louder than any gavel he could hold. The prosecutor, unaware of the turmoil, pressed on with his accusation fervently, but his words blurred into a distant hum. The real conflict wasn't between prosecution and defense. It was between past and present, between pride and redemption. Isabella raised her eyes and met Lorenzo's gaze. There was no hatred in her look, only pain and dignity. That silent exchange was more devastating than any evidence presented. He felt she saw right through him, as if she could see the hidden scar on his soul. He tried to look away, but the intensity of her gaze held him. He felt exposed, as if the entire courtroom could read his mind. Cold sweat trickled down the back of his neck, and his hands gripped the arms of his chair to steady their trembling. With every second, the internal battle grew more intense. If he followed his usual path, he would condemn Isabella without hesitation. But that would mean burying his sister's memory once and for all, silently admitting his own guilt. If, on the other hand, he chose compassion, he would call into question his entire career, his reputation, and the image of the infallible judge the world admired. It was a leap into the unknown, with no guarantees. The courtroom waited in anticipation. The audience, the lawyers, and Isabella herself awaited his word. But Lorenzo knew that before he could speak to them, he had to win the war raging inside him. And in that suffocating silence, it became clear. The real trial hadn't begun yet. It was just about to take place within Lorenzo Heredero. Isabella slowly rose to her feet, asking permission to speak in her own defense. Her voice, though trembling, echoed clearly through the hall. "If the law says I'm guilty, I accept the sentence. But if life asked me to choose again, I would do it all over to save my sister." The courtroom remained silent, absorbing every word as if it were a sacred confession. Lorenzo kept his eyes fixed on her, but his breathing quickened. With every word Isabella spoke, it felt like the inner walls of his fortress were collapsing. The memory of his sister, begging for his support, resurfaced with crushing force. The contrast between what Isabella did and what he failed to do was unbearable. Isabella continued, her voice growing steadier. "I didn't steal out of greed. I wasn't seeking power. I just wanted to give a chance at life to the only person I had left." Her hands trembled, but her eyes shone with conviction. The audience, moved, watched in silence, as if no one dared break the moment. Her words cut through Lorenzo's chest like sharp blades. He remembered his last conversation with his sister, when, out of pride, he refused to admit she needed him. Now, facing Isabella, he felt condemned by his own silence from the past.
Some members of the audience discreetly wiped away tears. Journalists exchanged glances, already aware that this hearing would go down in history. This wasn't just a legal trial, it was a human one, where values greater than the law were at stake. Lorenzo tried to pull himself together, but Isabella's voice seemed to speak directly to his conscience. It was as if she had traveled through time and become the voice of the sister he couldn't save. The weight of that realization made him falter. The proud judge he once was no longer existed in the same way. In his place stood a vulnerable man trying to remain standing in the face of a truth that stripped him bare. His rigid posture now seemed like nothing more than a fragile disguise, ready to crumble at any moment. "If this is a crime," Isabella concluded, tears streaming down her face, "then let the law condemn me. But let everyone here know this: I could never forgive myself for not trying to save someone I love." A murmur swept through the courtroom, and the silence that followed was even more deafening. Lorenzo felt his heart clench. A conviction seemed inevitable, but he knew this was no longer just about Isabella. It was about him, his sister, and all the choices that had haunted him until this very moment. And for the first time in his career, Lorenzo realized he was facing something greater than the law. He was facing his own redemption. The tension in the room was almost palpable. Every eye was fixed on Lorenzo, waiting for his decision. Journalists held their pens ready, prepared to record the ruling that could change careers and headlines. The audience, in complete silence, seemed to be holding its breath. Lorenzo, however, remained still. On the outside, he maintained the image of the cold judge, but inside, the battle raged on. His thoughts were tangled, weaving Isabella's words together with the painful memories of his sister. The prosecutor, growing restless, urged the judge not to be swayed by emotional appeals. He insisted that the law must prevail, without exceptions, but his words rang hollow. For Lorenzo, it was impossible to ignore the humanity of the situation. Every second of silence heightened the anticipation. Lawyers whispered among themselves, and the audience stirred with restrained murmurs. Some believed Lorenzo would deliver his usual harsh sentence. Others sensed something extraordinary was about to happen.
Lorenzo passed a hand over his face, a rare gesture for someone who cultivated an image of detachment. His eyes, once sharp as steel, now revealed a shadow of pain. The audience noticed, and the tension grew tighter. He lightly raised his gavel, but his hand hesitated in the air. That simple gesture became a symbol of the internal struggle everyone sensed, but didn't fully understand. It was as if Isabella's fate hung suspended along with that gavel.
From the defendant's table, Isabella kept her gaze fixed on Lorenzo. There was no pleading in her eyes, only dignity. That struck him harder than any tears could have. He felt as if she were silently telling him she wasn't seeking pity, only recognition of her truth. The courtroom seemed frozen in time. The sound of a cup dropping in the back echoed like an explosion, only to be swallowed again by the suffocating silence. It was one of those moments where everyone knew something significant was about to happen. Lorenzo took a deep breath but couldn't speak. The weight of every word he might say felt overwhelming. The entire courtroom waited, but he wasn't ready yet. The real confrontation was still to come. And so, in that suspended moment, it became clear it wasn't just Isabella being judged. It was Lorenzo Herdero standing before everyone, and most importantly, before himself. The courtroom awaited the sentence, but Lorenzo remained silent for several long seconds. The weight of his robe felt suffocating. He sensed that if he spoke his usual words, something inside him would break for good. Then, in an unexpected move, he pushed the case documents aside and faced everyone with tear-filled eyes. "You know me as a relentless judge," he began, his voice trembling. The audience held its breath. "But today I'm not just a judge. Today I'm a man facing the cruelest mirror of all, that of my own conscience." His words echoed through the room, heavy with pain. Lorenzo took another deep breath and continued. He confessed that he too had had a sick sister, and that out of pride he had failed to help her. He told them how he hid behind work and coldness until her death became his silent sentence. The entire courtroom fell silent, stunned by his revelation. Some lawyers exchanged disbelieving glances. Journalists, in shock, scribbled frantically. Never before had Lorenzo shown any vulnerability. Now, in front of everyone, he was exposing his deepest wound. It was like watching a monument crumble. Isabella, moved, let her tears flow freely. She hadn't expected the man judging her to carry a pain so similar to her own. In her heart, a silent bond formed between them, stronger than any sentence. If condemning Isabella is the price of a cold, unfeeling law, then so be it. But if justice also means having the courage to see another's pain, then I cannot look away," Lorenzo declared, his voice wavering between strength and fragility. The audience was spellbound. Some cried quietly. Others could only watch, unable to believe what they were witnessing. The untouchable judge was finally showing his humanity.
He lowered the gavel, but did not use it. His hands trembled visibly. For the first time, Lorenzo was not afraid to show weakness. The silence that filled the room was not one of judgment, but of respect. The monument of ice that Lorenzo had built over the years was crumbling before everyone's eyes. And paradoxically, it was in this moment of collapse that he revealed himself to be more human, more genuine, and more noble than he had ever been. The entire courtroom waited anxiously. The judge, who had always embodied the coldness of the law, now stood at a crossroads.
Lorenzo took a deep breath, raised his eyes, and announced in a choked voice, "Isabella, you are acquitted." The impact was immediate. Murmurs spread through the audience. Journalists rose in a frenzy, and lawyers exchanged looks of disbelief. It was the first time Lorenzo had defied expectations of a conviction. The sentence echoed like an earthquake through the legal system. Isabella couldn't hold back her tears. The young woman covered her face in relief, while her sister, seated in the audience, wept with gratitude. The decision meant more than just freedom. It was a recognition that love could not be judged solely by cold, hard rules. Lorenzo, still visibly shaken, continued, "Today, I realize that justice cannot only be about the law. It must also be about humanity. And if it's a crime to act out of love, then I myself should be sitting in the defendant's chair." His words were met with a profound silence. The fellow judges in the room exchanged glances, torn between disapproval and admiration. Some saw weakness in his actions, while others recognized courage in his gesture. What no one could deny was that this moment marked a historic turning point. Lorenzo set the gavel down on the table without his usual ceremony. It was as if he were saying he no longer needed this symbol of authority. The real weight had been carried in his heart for years, and now he was finally beginning to free himself from it. Isabella, overwhelmed, thanked him with a simple look. No words were necessary. The invisible bond that united them in that moment was worth more than any public acknowledgement. The audience, stunned, rose in spontaneous applause. Some, it's true, muttered quiet protests, accusing him of bias, but most were swept up by the raw emotion of what they had witnessed. It was a rare display of humanity in a place usually ruled by rigidity. Lorenzo remained seated, taking deep breaths as if he had just fought the greatest battle of his life. And in a way, he had. But he knew this verdict wasn't the end of anything. It was only the beginning of his own redemption. In the heart of the courtroom, Lorenzo Herdero ceased to be just a judge. He became a man.
The next day, newspapers splashed Lorenzo's face across their headlines in bold letters. "The judge broken by truth," "The man behind the robe," "Scandal" or "Courage." Each publication offered its own interpretation. Social media buzzed with debate, dividing public opinion in a battle of hashtags. Some hailed him as a hero, finally capable of humanizing the justice system. Others accused him of betrayal, claiming he had placed emotions above the law. His fellow judges were outraged, while more progressive legal scholars defended him as a pioneer. Lorenzo's decision, more than just acquitting Isabella, exposed the system's own fragility. Lorenzo watched the turmoil in silence. Isolated in his mansion, he received endless phone calls, interview requests, veiled threats, criticism, and praise. His image, once a symbol of rigidity, had now become the focus of a national debate. Isabella, meanwhile, was embraced by her sister with tears of relief. For her, the verdict meant so much more than freedom. It was proof that her fight hadn't been in vain. Though grateful, she knew the greater weight had fallen on Lorenzo. That night, Lorenzo went out alone for a walk, something he hadn't done in years. He felt the cold wind on his face. No photographers, no robe, no applause or criticism. For the first time in a long while, he walked simply as an ordinary man. With every step, he reflected on the impact of his words in the courtroom. He had bared himself before everyone, confessing his deepest pain. Paradoxically, he felt lighter, as if he had broken invisible chains that had imprisoned him for years. Still,
doubt gnawed at him. Had he done the right thing, or had he simply given in to emotion? The line between justice and compassion seemed too fine. But one certainty grew within him. He could no longer go on living the same way. He knew his career as a judge was compromised. His colleagues would never see him the same way again. The untouchable man had crumbled, and the myth had been replaced by a fallible human being. And for many, that revelation was unforgivable. Yet, as he looked up at the dark sky, Lorenzo realized something new. For the first time in years, he felt no shame when remembering his sister. He hadn't been able to save her, but perhaps he could save others. The trial wasn't over. It had simply moved to a different courtroom. The next morning, Lorenzo called a press conference. Journalists packed the auditorium, eager to hear from the man who had shaken the foundations of the judiciary. Cameras, microphones, and lights surrounded him, but Lorenzo seemed calmer than ever. Standing tall, he announced his resignation as a judge. He said he could no longer judge others' lives when he was still learning to handle his own. His words sounded like both a confession and a liberation, drawing mixed reactions from the crowd. Some journalists tried to challenge him, accusing him of cowardice. Others, moved, recognized rare courage in him. Lorenzo, however, wasn't seeking applause or excuses. He spoke only with the sincerity of someone who had finally accepted his own humanity. After the announcement, he laid his robe on the table in front of the cameras as a symbol of his departure. The gesture was replayed countless times on news broadcasts, becoming a historic image, the judge who walked away from power to find himself.
Back in the solitude of his mansion, Lorenzo felt the weight of his decision. For the first time in years, there were no case files on his desk, no trials awaiting his judgment. The routine that had defined him had vanished. All that remained was emptiness and freedom. The silence in the house seemed deeper than ever before. But instead of suffocating him, it brought a strange sense of peace. He no longer had to hide his pain behind verdicts. At last, he could look inward without fear. That night, standing before the mirror, Lorenzo saw himself as never before. No robe, no masks, no titles. Just a man marked by pain, yet willing to start over. For the first time, he could hold his own gaze. Despite the calm he felt, he knew his life would change dramatically. Without the robe, he had lost status, prestige, and influence. But he had gained something he'd never truly had before, the chance to be authentic. The weight of his resignation was heavy, yet paradoxically, Lorenzo felt lighter. It was as if he had finally let go of the chains that had bound him to a version of himself that was never real. And so, in the silence of that night, an idea began to take shape, to turn his pain into purpose, his loss into a legacy, his weakness into strength for others. The days following his resignation were filled with deep reflection. Lorenzo, now free from the constraints of his judicial role, searched for new meaning in his life. During a quiet visit to a public hospital, he observed children and young people fighting illnesses, many without access to even the most basic treatment. The scene reopened the wound of his sister's memory, but it also planted a seed of change. He decided his fortune would no longer be spent on luxuries and appearances. Instead, he began sketching plans for an institute that would provide real support to vulnerable youth, not just medical care, but also education, opportunities to learn, and a place to belong. It would be a space to transform lives. He gathered advisors and specialists, surprising them with his new vision. Some, accustomed to the arrogant Lorenzo, doubted his sincerity, but he convinced them with a different light in his eyes, one born of remorse and a genuine desire to make amends. Isabella, now free, received an unexpected invitation. Lorenzo reached out to her personally, asking her to be one of the project's coordinators. Hesitant at first, she eventually accepted when she saw the authenticity in his words. To her, this gesture was proof that his redemption was rooted in action, not just words. The news spread quickly. The former millionaire judge Lorenzo Hedero was founding an institute for vulnerable youth. Once again, opinions were divided. Some accused him of seeking attention. Others saw a man rising from his own ashes.
For Lorenzo, it didn't matter. For the first time, he wasn't seeking outside approval. His purpose was clear: to give other young people the chance his sister never had, the chance he had been too proud to offer. The Institute would be more than just a charity. It would be his way of asking for forgiveness. As construction began, Lorenzo felt that every brick laid was a step toward healing his own soul. The emptiness that once consumed him was slowly being filled by something greater than himself. In the quiet of his room, he remembered his sister's face in her final moments. For the first time, he was able to smile when thinking of her, not as a ghost of pain, but as an inspiration to move forward. And so, Lorenzo discovered that true greatness wasn't found in the power to judge, but in the power to transform lives. The Institute opened its doors months later, with a simple yet deeply meaningful ceremony. Young people from all walks of life filled the space, each carrying stories of struggle, hope, and pain. To them, this place wasn't just a building, it was a chance to start over. Isabella took on an active role in the project, mentoring young people with talents in technology. She used her own experience to show them that knowledge could be a tool for building up, not tearing down. Many saw her as an example of resilience. Lorenzo walked through the halls, observing every detail. For the first time, he felt useful outside the courtroom. The smile of a child receiving a book, the hug of a young person awarded a scholarship, all of it showed him he was on the right path. The press, curious, followed the project closely. News reports featured stories of helped youth, grateful families, and emotional testimonials. Slowly, Lorenzo's public image began to rebuild, not through the authority of his robe, but through the humility of his actions. Despite these successes, the journey wasn't easy. There were criticisms, financial challenges, and logistical hurdles. But instead of backing down, Lorenzo faced each obstacle as part of the process. Unlike in the past, he no longer ran from pain. He met it head-on. His lonely nights in the mansion were replaced with meetings, visits, and conversations with young people and their families. Lorenzo discovered the value of listening, something he had never practiced before. He learned that often the greatest justice was simply giving a voice to those who had never been heard. Isabella, watching his transformation, began to believe that the man who had once judged her so harshly had finally found his true humanity. Between them grew a relationship built on respect and trust, forged not in the courtroom, but through shared pain. Every young person who walked through the Institute's doors represented, to Lorenzo, a piece of the story he couldn't change with his sister. But now, in every smile he helped create, he found a way to honor her memory.
Slowly, the once arrogant former judge was transforming into a mentor, a guide, and an example that even the deepest mistakes can bear fruits of hope. And deep down, Lorenzo knew he wasn't just rebuilding lives, he was rebuilding his own. The day of the official inauguration of the Herdeiro Institute arrived with an atmosphere filled with emotion. Unlike the grand ceremonies he was used to, Lorenzo chose something simple, a modest auditorium filled with the young people they were helping, their families, and the staff. There was no luxury, only smiles and hope. When he stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. The man once known as the Iron Judge now stood before them with no robe, no masks, just a calm expression. He looked at the audience and paused for a few seconds before he began to speak. His voice, steady yet gentle, carried sincerity. "I spent years believing that greatness lay in power, wealth, and the image I projected to the world. But I learned in the most painful way that none of that matters if there's no humanity. Today, I am here to say that true greatness is born from humility." His words struck a chord. Many of the young people listening saw themselves reflected in this man who openly admitted his mistakes without fear. Parents wiped quiet tears, moved that someone with so much influence had chosen to extend the hand rather than build walls. Isabella, seated in the front row, smiled softly. In her heart, she knew this moment was living proof that even those who had made the biggest mistakes could find redemption. The bond between her and Lorenzo, forged in suffering, was now blossoming into hope. Lorenzo continued, sharing his story without shame. He spoke of his sister, his guilt, his arrogance, and above all, the transformation that brought him here. "I can't change the past, but I can use what I've learned to change futures, and that's what this institute represents, a second chance, not just for you, but for me too." The auditorium erupted in applause, but Lorenzo didn't raise his arms in triumph. He simply bowed his head in respect. For the first time, he felt he had nothing left to prove to anyone. Humility had replaced pride, and that was enough. After his speech, he walked among the young people, shaking hands, listening to their stories, laughing and crying with them. He was no longer a distant judge on a pedestal, but a present and engaged man, willing to share in their lives. Every hug he received felt like another inner wound beginning to heal. As the event drew to a close, Lorenzo gazed out at the horizon through the auditorium windows. For the first time in many years, he felt he was exactly where he was meant to be, not in the courtroom, not in his mansion, but among these lives that were just beginning to rebuild. The legacy being born was not that of a millionaire judge, but of a man who had found his true greatness in humility. And deep down, he knew his sister would be smiling proudly. This was Lorenzo's journey, from arrogant judge to humble man who discovered true greatness. And if you believe stories like this can change lives and stir emotions, subscribe to the channel now. Your next powerful story starts right here.